Welcome to the Americas 360 podcast. Get the inside scoop and the outside perspective on the latest developments from Canada, Latin America, and everywhere in between. Americas 360 is a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of Americas 360. I'm your host, John Molesky. This program is brought to you by the world's #1 think tank for regional studies, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. And Americas 360 is a collaboration among the center's Argentina Project, Brazil Institute, Canada Institute, Latin American Program, and Mexico Institute. Well, migration from the nations in the Americas to the U.S. has increased exponentially since the year 2020. In fact, migrants from the region account for more than 75% of encounters with U.S. Border Patrol during the past 3 years alone. A combination of political, economic, and health crises in the region have resulted in a large exodus from Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. The Trump administration implemented Title 42 and the Migrant Protection Protocols, MPP, commonly referred to as the Remain in Mexico program. This resulted in an increase in deportations and border security. The policy has forced migrants to remain in Mexico while they await immigration proceedings in the U.S. Today, we'll ask our panel about trends in migration and about shifts in policies in reaction to those trends. Please welcome back to the program Latin American Program Acting Director Benjamin Gadan.
John, good to be back.
Great to have you, Benjamin. Mexico Institute Director Andrew Rudman.
John, hi, everybody.
Hey, Andrew, great to see you. Canada Institute Director Christopher Sands.
Bonjour, hello, John.
Bonjour to you as well, Christopher. And Wilson Center Distinguished Fellow, Cindy Arnson.
Hey, John. Great to be with you.
Hey, Cindy. Great to see all of you again. So let's dig in. We previewed this discussion of trends. So let's start there with trends. And let's go in the order of introduction and have each of you identified the trends that you're observing right now and whether these trends speak to an increase in migration or a decrease in migration or something altogether unpredictable. Benjamin, you're up.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen a sustained increase in migration since basically the end of the Trump administration. There have been changes in the composition of that migration, but typically migration to the United States, migration through Latin America is a barometer of the health of the region. And the region is suffering gravely right now. Impacts of climate change, political and economic instability, the public health impacts of the pandemic and the economic consequences. So as the region suffers, Latin Americans are on the move and many of them arrive at the United States southwest border.
You know, I said I was going to do this in the order of introduction, but for very specific reasons, which will be revealed to all momentarily, I'm going to shift things up. And Cindy, I'm going to come to you next on this question of the trends that you are observing.
Sure. Well, I agree with Benjamin that the migration flows are unprecedented and have become a very contentious political issue in the United States, as we've seen for many, many years. It's important to note, however, that the United States is not the only migrant receiving country in the Americas. This was something that was driven home at the Summit of the Americas last June in Los Angeles. There are 6.8 million Venezuelans who have fled that country since about 2014. The vast majority of them, 5.75 million, are in Latin America and the Caribbean, and that includes 2.5 million in Colombia alone, and over 1 million in Peru. Similarly, Nicaraguans have been increasingly fleeing the dictatorship in Nicaragua and going to neighboring Costa Rica. Costa Rica is a country of only about 5 million people, but it's the number 4 country globally in terms of the number of asylum applications. The vast majority, something like 90% of those asylum applications from Nicaraguans. Costa Rica is only behind the United States, Germany, and Mexico in terms of the number of asylum claims. So it is a regional phenomenon, but the pressures that Benjamin mentioned, especially the economic reversals, the political crises in countries like Haiti, which had a president assassinated in 2021 and basically has become almost ungoverned, if not ungovernable. There have been increased numbers of Haitians, increased numbers of Cubans following the street protests that took place in 2021. So there are, specific countries that have seen a huge spike. Central America also, the chronic problems of unemployment, of gang violence, of lack of opportunity, especially for young people in Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, added to climate pressures that we can talk about later. I mean, the drivers have always been there, but I think it would be disingenuous not to admit or to put out there that there is a perception in the region that somehow the Biden administration was going to be more forgiving towards migration than President Trump was. And he has been in certain respects, but in other respects, proponents of immigration reform are greatly critical of the Biden administration for failing to reverse a number of the policies put in place during the Trump years. So I think the predominant dynamic is push, but there is an element of pull as well.
Well, Cindy, thanks for teeing up the question of differences between these U.S. administrations and what impact it might be having. We are going to move to that next, but before we do that, the reason I switched up the order, as I was, thinking of your areas of expertise, Mexico, Andrew, up next. If moving south to north, most roads lead to Mexico, right? You sit there in the middle of this as either a destination or an entry point or a pass through. What is the Mexican perspective on trends as we're speaking of them now? What do you see happening?
That's a great question, John, and you're right in this case. Maybe not all, but many roads do in fact lead to and through Mexico, and it's important to keep in mind, as my colleagues have noted, that a long time ago migration was all Mexicans coming to the United States, and over time we've had ebbs and flows. Migration from Mexicans is up right now, and that, as Cindy and Benjamin alluded to, has to do with the pandemic and economics, and also in some cases in Mexico and other places, of course, security. I think we have to highlight or recognize whenever we talk about this. These people are migrating because they're making a rational choice that risking their lives and spending lots of money to pay people off is the best thing for them to do. And I think it's just, we have to remember that these are pretty dire circumstances that people find themselves in. Mexico is, of course, both a sender and a receiver, and Mexico has tried, the AMLO administration has tried to be, in one sense, a gatekeeper, trying through its National Guard to reduce the flows and regularize flows going north. So as the sort of pipeline approach, trying to provide protection for migrants, but has also cooperated with the United States in the flows, and also in security matters. When President López Obrador met with President Biden in July, Mexico made a commitment to spend $1.5 billion on border infrastructure and border security. So that's not an insignificant contribution to the efforts. And I think the other thing that to point out, and I'll close there, is that when they met after the Summit of the Americas, and Mexico too did not, at least at the presidential level, did not attend the Summit of the Americas, but the two countries in their joint declaration agreed to collaborate on root causes, which gets to that point of people moving because they feel they have to, and on maintaining strong borders. So really that sort of two sides of the same coin approach.
Thanks. As we continue north, Christopher, clearly this issue looks different by the time you reach Canada, right? As far as people coming in or people moving out. Give us the Canadian perspective on movement in the Americas.
Great question, John. Canada's got a very open approach to immigration, and that's because they've always had a point system, so that for regular migration, they're looking for people who have skills that their population needs. Canada's about 10% larger than the United States in terms of land, but then have a little bit more than 10% of the size of population. So they have a low population density. There are a lot of skills they're looking for, and so that has made migration popular. And to give you a sense, let's see, the current statistics are for 2021. Canada had about 7.8 million people in the population who had been born abroad. And that's about 22% of Canada's population. That's a very large group. That's a kind of what we would think of as a big migration wave, but that's where the normal set is. Now, if you look at more recent trends, one of the things that's interesting is those deliberate migrants are declining. And Canada's had a rate of about 6.1%, 6.1 new migrants per thousand people, which is down about 2% from the previous year. And there's been a steady decline over the last decade of people migrating purposefully. On the other hand, refugees are a special case. Refugees have benefited from the very positive attitude about migration and sympathy for where they're coming from, particularly Ukraine. And so last year, 2021, Canada had 130,000 in migration refugee status successful refugee applications. Sorry, I'm all bumbled here. But that's a 19% increase over previous years. So Canada's taken that as a very global view. Now, many of those migrants are coming from Asia. And where the Americas comes in, traditionally, Canada has not been a major source of migration from the Western Hemisphere, although they do draw a lot of people from Caribbean countries, and they have done very well, in particular with Haitians, partly through Commonwealth and Francophonie connections. That's starting to change. And at the Summit of the Americas, President Biden worked with Justin Trudeau to create a new quota to try to have Canada take 5,000 Central American migrants in the next year, just because of there are so many. And it was a real challenge, but something that the Canadians have generally embraced. So Canada's role in the hemisphere may start to look like its role globally as a magnet for new migrants, particularly for refugees.
Thanks, Chris. And Benjamin, I just wanted our listeners to know you're in Argentina right now, and you had an interesting observation about the point Cindy made that no one is untouched by the circumstances that we're talking about.
It's true, John. I mean, I think often we distinguish the current regional migration crisis by the scale of the crisis and the numbers arriving in the United States. And it's true, the numbers are unprecedentedly high, and the numbers have been sustained for quite a while. But actually, I think what's newest is the geographic scope. So you point out, I'm in Argentina right now in Buenos Aires, I don't know, over 4,000 miles from Venezuela. There are 170,000 Venezuelans now in this country. There's arepas on every menu. I was just curious the other day at a local bakery, and I asked, are there any Venezuelans working here? And they said, are there any Argentines working here? The entire staff was Venezuelan, making these traditional facturas, these Argentine pastries. So it really is incredible. It's Haitians who left Chile, after a different crisis in Haiti and are now traveling all the way up to the United States. It's Cubans at a scale we haven't seen in decades. So really, it's no longer, Mexicans from the South, Guatemalans, Hondurans, Salvadorans. It's almost everyone on the move going almost everywhere in the hemisphere.
The scale and the scope of what we're talking about is, as you mentioned, it's from the small to the large. It's enormous. And my concern on any discussion like this is that we'll spend a lot of time talking about the problems and run out of time before we can start talking about potential solutions. So let's segue into talking about responses or potential solutions. Cindy, if we could start with you. And one way to think about this is if you could intervene into a certain situation, create more political stability in one country versus another, what do you think would move the needle most effectively? That's in the realm of possibility. Cindy.
Well, I would say the one thing that would move the needle is economic recovery in Venezuela that would lead to, which could only come about, I think, as a result of a political settlement there, an end that would also lead to an end of U.S. sanctions, and I think, be a huge relief for the countries of the region that have been receiving these millions of migrants. But there have been some really extraordinary responses by countries that have far fewer resources than the United States or even Canada. In Colombia, the previous administration of President Iván Duque declared temporary protected status for about 1.7 million Venezuelans that were in Colombia as of January of this year. Now, those protections don't cover people that have entered subsequently, and we know that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of people still leaving Venezuela every day the closest country, the first country that they get to, is usually Colombia. And nonetheless, Colombia, which was facing its own, huge problems during the pandemic, decided to take a bet on migrants as being an overall plus for the economy, something that people that provided an initial or who needed initial humanitarian support when they first arrived, but over time became entrepreneurs and contributed to the economy. Ecuador has done something similar. Peru is a little bit further behind, but there are efforts to actually integrate refugees and migrants into the economic and political and social safety net systems in those countries, which is quite striking given the overall hostility in the United States, not only by the federal government, but also by state governments, municipal governments, to refugees. We're in a situation now where there are busloads of people arriving almost every day from the southwest border of the United States, trying to make the impact of undocumented migration felt in the nation's capital. Of course, it doesn't fall on the federal government to deal with those people; it falls on the municipality. But nonetheless, there's a sense of wanting to, spread the impact of that, beyond the border.
Chris Sands.
It's interesting. One of the tools that governments have used since 1967 is the UN Convention on the Status of Refugees. And that created an idea, the idea of a safe third country. Rather than have people wander far from home, the idea was go to the nearest safe country and then apply to go further afield if you would like status. And that was meant to create some control and some safety for people. And frontline states of troubled regions, like Colombia with regard to Venezuela or Poland now with regard to Ukraine, would get assistance, often financial assistance and resources from other countries to help manage those populations right close to home. Well, this is now being challenged by something called the Global Compact on Migration, which argues that people migrate, and the old idea of 1967 where you need to stay close to home because you wanted to be able to get back. Now with the internet and cell phones and so on, being far away is no huge barrier to being able to go back and eventually repatriate. So they're looking to put people further afield. Canada has, in 2020, an amazing case brought by the Canadian Council on Refugees against the government that argued that Canada had designated the United States a safe third country for migrants coming from the Caribbean and from Latin America, and that this designation was not thoroughly granted, and that actually in 2020, Canada, then in the looking at the Trump administration in the United States, was wrong to say that the U.S. was a safe third country. So the court invalidated that designation of the U.S. as a safe third country, leaving Canada in a bit of a bind. They asked for a stay of the judgment. And this year, in 2022, the Supreme Court of Canada is again reviewing the government's finding that the U.S. is a safe third country. If they lose that, it's going to be very tough for the Canadian government to manage migration flows. It's a sleeper story, but one that has big implications for U.S.-Canada relations.
Thanks, Chris. Andrew Rudman.
Thanks, John. I just, I think, as you said, we should talk a little bit about what, what do we do about it? And, I think for the U.S., one thing to keep in mind is that the number of currently unfilled jobs, that is the number of jobs for which there's no workers, is numerically pretty close to equal to the decrease in legal migration into the United States over the past few years. So there's a pretty clear supply and demand mismatch there that could be addressed. And one way to do that would be expansion of the H-2A, which is the temporary agricultural worker visas, and the H-2B, which is the non-agricultural and unskilled workers. There's clearly a lot of demand. What we see, particularly in agriculture, which is so critically important for U.S.-Mexico, is that Americans, citizens of the U.S. don't want to work in the fields. And so you see Mexicans picking produce across North America, and increasing those numbers perhaps has been talked about before. Facilitating access to H-2A visas from Central Americans would be one way to both address our labor shortage, which obviously has an impact on inflation, and also regularize migration. Fixing a longer term, fixing our asylum system is something that people also talk about. Just, you have all these people who are essentially waiting for their cases to be heard. I think one question it poses that I don't have an answer to is a lot of the people claiming asylum are probably not going to get it because economics is not usually a justification. So I think that does lead future to you get through all the applicants and then you have to figure out what happens to the people who aren't granted asylum.
Thank you, Andrew. Benjamin, we've talked a lot about the notion that if certain circumstances could be improved, people would be less likely to leave home, but they are leaving home because that's not the case. How should we think about this? Are people moving permanently? Is this an exodus that will last for the rest of their lives? Or are they biding their time until things improve and then they'll at least hope to return home? Do we have any data that lets us know about what the circumstances are and what the implications are if these are permanent moves?
Yeah, thanks for asking that, John. I think we have to be realistic about the plans that these migrants have when they flee from their homes. And if they don't plan to return, we need to plan for their integration into their new communities. I'm glad Andrew brought up job opportunities in the United States. The same kinds of conversations need to be happening in lots of countries throughout the Americas. And you asked John about data. There is plenty of survey data that shows that people leaving places like Venezuela, Nicaragua, they don't plan to return home anytime soon, nor is there any prospect of solving the political and economic problems, the security problems, the climate change problems that have led them to leave their homes and communities. And so given the scale of the challenges in their homes and given the data we have on their intentions, I think we have to think seriously about ways to increase job opportunities for them, to regularize their status. We in Los Angeles during the Summit of the Americas, we hosted the then president of Colombia, the president of Ecuador, and a lot of experts. And the subject was not how do we find ways to temporarily warehouse these individuals until they can go back home, but rather how do we integrate them into their new communities so they can be productive and welcome members of their new homes.
Thanks. We're almost out of time, but Cindy, you raised earlier disappointment among people who'd like to see reforms, disappointment with the Biden administration and its actions or lack of actions. I want to ask you about that because I'm reminded of the old adage of walking and chewing gum at the same time, and we've had the Russian invasion of Ukraine and all kinds of major issues to deal with. Is there an expectation that the Biden administration will get to this, or is it just not as large a priority as many hoped it would be?
Well, it should be a priority because it's such a politically divisive topic in this country and is used for political ends through just the sheer mobilization of xenophobia. The truth is there are no easy solutions to migration. The push dynamics are not going to go away. Even if we could address root causes of the Central American crises, multiple crises, it's still going to be at least a decade, and we've already been trying for close to a decade to address those issues. Climate change is only going to get worse, creating more drought, more flooding, more hurricanes, more pressures for people to migrate. There was an effort over a decade ago to come up with a bipartisan agreement on migration in the U.S. Senate, and it went nowhere. And I think that there need to be solutions that come from a real sort of effort to come to grips in a bipartisan way with the pressures of migration. And I think that in the kinds of polarized environment that we live in, that kind of agreement is not going to be likely. So I think the Biden administration is doing its best to manage it, to be more humane. They're not separating children from their parents, as happened, in previous years. But they also have to keep this border issue from blowing up in their faces politically. And some border states are, in fact, swing states. So it's very politically complicated, no easy solutions, and I would say no bipartisan compromises on the horizon.
Speaking of those political complications, our crack team in the Mexico Institute, I see Andrew has told me that Leila has informed him that for border governorships in the U.S. are up for grabs in the November election. And so, as we know, domestic politics often intervenes when it comes to international crises and things that need to be handled across borders. So that's something to watch as well. There's no neat, tidy package to end a discussion like this. So what we can just do is pledge to our listeners that we'll revisit it, right? Because there's always more to talk about. But thank you, Cindy, Benjamin, Chris, Andrew. We look forward to learning more from you in future episodes, and thanks for your insights this time around. This episode of America's 360 was produced by Oscar Cruz, Cecily Fasanella, and Zoe Reed, with the assistance of Joseph Bouchard, Thomas Michael, and Sophia Schuckner. We hope you enjoyed this episode and that you'll join us again next time. Until then, for all of us at the Wilson Center and America's 360, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for joining us.
You have been listening to America's 360, a podcast about the innumerable ties among the nations of the Western Hemisphere. You can subscribe wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. To learn more about our programs, please visit wilsoncenter.org. And please join us again next time for another episode of America's 360.